history-changing events in rhinology, and I got to figure out how this thing works here. What is it? And where do we go from here? All right. Those are my disclosures, which whipped right by there because there's really nothing there of relevance to what we're talking about today. So, management of sinusitis, sinus surgery, has quite a long and sordid history. Hippocrates is credited with the very first surgical description for management of nasal polyps when he pulled a ligature through the nose with a little sponge of some sort tied to the back end and pulled it from the nasopharynx forward and just sort of amputated whatever came out. Theoretically polyps, but also middle turbinate, inferior turbinate, and probably pretty much everything else. And that unpleasant procedure was pretty much how far medicine and surgery advanced for the next couple thousand years. Joseph Haydn, the famous composer who's here, had a similar procedure performed on him. I love this picture because you can see Haydn, it's a profile shot, and you can see he's kind of got that pursed lip kind of look to him where he's clearly mouth breathing. And he had nasal polyps and suffered from nasal polyps his entire career. In fact, to the point where for several years he was unable to basically perform any composing at all as a result of being disabled from his nasal polyps. He complained, ultimately had a similar procedure performed, a polypectomy performed in 1783. And after that procedure, suggested that his surgeons should putrefy under the earth. So ENT surgeons were not very popular in the 1700s. And we all are aware of Mosher's famous quote from 1929 that sinus surgery, any surgery in the ethmoid sinuses should be simple, but it's proven one of the easiest ways to kill a patient. And to some degree, that still is true even today. Now, how does this start out? Well, the number one first history-changing event in rhinology was the development of cocaine. All right? And I'm going to focus a lot on cocaine because this really is quite an interesting story in how it got applied to medicine and to our world in rhinology. Coca's been around for obviously thousands of years, and in fact, there have been traces of cocaine that have been found in mummies from 3,000 years ago or so in South America. So we know that people have been interested in cocaine for quite a while. It was originally confined to just the eastern Andes region, but it spread essentially throughout the entire Incan Empire and was quite prevalent throughout the Incan region and thought to be really of divine origin. And so as a result, the Incans actually subjected it to a state monopoly. It was only available, cocaine was only available through the state, Coca specifically. This little figure here in the corner, that's actually from the first millennia, and it's a little statue from South America that was found, and that figure is actually eating or sucking on the coca leaves. So the Europeans were very interested in coca when they visited South America. When Pizarro showed up in the 1500s, one of his teammates there was Vicente de Valverde, and he notes that coca is the one thing that the Indians are ne'er without in their mouths. They say sustains them and gives them refreshment so that even under the sun they feel not the heat, and it is worth its weight in gold in these parts, accounting for the major portion of the tithes. So they recognized how popular it was with the Incans and were very curious about it. But interestingly, cocaine was difficult to get to Europe. They wanted to study it. They wanted to study the leaves, but they couldn't get it to Europe in order to do the studies until the mid-1800s. And this is when Albert Niemann shows up, 1859. He's a PhD student in chemistry, and he is able to get some cocaine leaves, study it, and produces the first treatise on cocaine in 1860. And it's called On a New Organic Base in the Coca Leaves. And Niemann actually notes in his treatise, he says, its solutions have an alkaline reaction, a bitter taste, promote the flow of saliva, and leave a peculiar numbness, followed by a sense of cold when applied to the tongue. So apparently he was putting it in his mouth and checking it out. The story of Niemann is kind of interesting because the next year, actually, after he studied cocaine, he discovered something called mustard gas. and he died when he discovered mustard gas for kind of obvious reasons. So we never got any more studies on cocaine out of Dr. Niemann, but needless to say, his contributions were significant. Now, you know, this is 1860, and now by 1863, cocaine is actually being rapidly becoming rapidly available both in Europe and in the United States. And it's usually as an additive to some sort of material. So it's being added to tonics, teas, lozenges, cigarettes, all of them being proposed to have multiple health benefits when you use this cocaine-laced product. The most successful and most interesting was Coca wine that was produced by a Corsican named Angelo Mariani wine, 1863. Now, Mariani wine probably wasn't all that good to taste, but boy, oh boy, it had a wallop in it of 7.2 milligrams of cocaine per ounce that he added to it. And he was also a master marketer. That was really his greatest contribution probably to this whole thing. And he had all these famous people that were advocates of Vin Mariani. Jules Verne is up in the top corner there. Down in the corner here, Three Musketeers, Alexander Dumas. You know, all these famous people were advocates of Vin Mariani. But my favorite, by far, Pope Leo. Pope Leo was used in advertisement for Vin Mariani, cocaine-laced wine. Fascinating. So the U.S., this was actually available in the U.S., but the U.S. is developing its own market for cocaine-laced products. And so this becomes interesting because this is the story then of Coca-Cola. And John Stith Pemberton, 1886, who was a pharmacist in Atlanta, he comes up with Pemberton's French wine Coca. All right? Now, it was originally an alcoholic product. So, but then Fulton County outlawed sale of alcohol. So then he creates this non-alcoholic version, which becomes somewhat famous in the United States. It is said to include a pinch of coca leaves until 1906, and that was when the U.S. outlawed the presence of coca in the actually in any of the products that were available out there as a result of the Pure Food and Drug Act. So Coca-Cola actually did have coca, raw coca in it until 1906. Now, the other part that's interesting about this is that Coca-Cola to this day continues to actually be the largest user of coca leaves in the entire world. Coca leaves are a part of the composition of Coca-Cola. They remove the cocaine, though, out of the coca leaves. And they just leave the some sort of byproduct. They do that up in New Jersey. I don't know how this all happens, but whatever. But they do it. They do it. So anyway, so the bottom line is Coca-Cola still has some coca leaves in it. Now, how did this get over to medicine? So, you know, Freud is credited, Sigmund Freud is actually credited with introducing coca to the world of medicine. He wrote the treatise Über Coca in 1884, and those, it's written in German, so I don't know this, but his biography describes it as a remarkable combination of objectivity with personal warmth, as if he were in love with the subject, the content. And indeed, he was somewhat in love with the content, as he's known to have ingested cocaine dozens of times, somewhere in the 50 to 100 milligrams at a time, particularly early in his career. We're not sure that he did it a whole lot later in his career, but he was doing it for years at a time earlier in his career. He described it as a magical drug, a most gorgeous excitement, all right? And he also was the first to propose cocaine as an antidote to morphine addiction, which is, and alcohol abuse as well, which is a real problem, as we'll see a little bit later on. Now, one of the things that Freud didn't do, which was probably a big mistake, is in this whole treatise, he doesn't really describe any of its anesthetic benefits. So he missed out on a huge possibility He does note in the very last paragraph that cocaine and its salts have a marked anesthetizing effect when brought into contact with the skin and the mucous membranes in concentrated solution. That's all he says in this multi-page manuscript. That's the only thing he said. So really, he doesn't get any credit for recognizing its anesthetic ability. Karl Kohler, his partner in Vienna, who was an ophthalmologist in Vienna, does, however, recognize this. And in fact, in 1884, his paper on use of cocaine in ophthalmologic surgery is read before a congress in Heidelberg. And they did, at that meeting, they did this live demonstration of surgery on the eye of a dog under cocaine anesthesia. And apparently it was just crazy. You know, everyone just was amazed by this demonstration. And needless to say, the benefits of cocaine as an anesthetic really took off at that point. And yes, it is true that he did earn the nickname Coca-Cola after this demonstration. True story. So Freud, till his death, he really felt slighted by the fact that he wasn't recognized as the person by the medical community who recognized the anesthetic effect of cocaine. So he actually does address this in his autobiography. And in 1925, he wrote that he blamed his failure to recognize the importance of its anesthetic properties on the distraction of his fiancée, Martha. So he did what all great men in history have done. He blamed his wife. So that's great. So, this is 1880s, and so, Karl Kohler is demonstrating the anesthetic effects in Heidelberg in 84, and in 1885, President Ulysses S. Grant is having an operation done, a tonsil biopsy, on his boat in the middle of the Potomac River under cocaine anesthesia. He's having his tonsil biopsied, which ended up being a big cancer, which ultimately killed him. But so you can tell how quickly the word spread that cocaine is a great anesthetic, and it just takes off like crazy around the world. William Halsted finds out about this. He's the first surgeon in chief, of course, at Johns Hopkins. He reads the initial descriptions in Lancet, tests its effect on by performing dental surgery on students. Those were the good old days. That's what we call it, the good old days. Unfortunately, Halsted also became addicted to morphine and to cocaine, and he used the cocaine as Freud had described it to try to get off of the morphine. And unfortunately, all that did was make him more addicted to other stuff, right? And so he really struggled with this throughout his entire career. And as he became more addicted, people recognized that he became more fastidious, actually, in his surgery with greater safety and greater attention to detail. And in fact, anyone who's read any biographies of Halsted, these were the words that people used to characterize how he operated, right? And you do kind of wonder, well, was this all a result of his cocaine addiction, or was this really who he was? Because it's kind of hard to separate the two, right? All right, so this is kind of cool. I know this is an otology, rhinology. I don't know anything about otology. However, I do remember that Julius Lempert had something to do with otology, right? And so this was actually a video here. Can we play this video? This is Julius Lempert in the early 1900s actually doing a septoplasty under cocaine anesthesia. This is the real deal here. You can see the patient is actually seated in the chair there, awake, of course, and he puts these little probe things in the nose. There it is. He's swabbing it, and he's going to swab the septum with the cocaine solution. And there he goes, uses a little D-knife to make his incision. Amazing video, to be honest, right? They're doing little superimposed dissection there and everything over the sidewall. And there he goes. He's putting his little swivel knife in there and taking a big wallop at the septum. So pretty good anesthesia, right? You know, and anyone, obviously, we can do some pretty decent amount of rhinologic procedures under local anesthesia, but the cocaine in particular was fairly effective and also fairly good at bleeding control. There he's got his little duckbill forceps to get some of that perpendicular plate, maybe a little bit of the cribriform, I don't know. We didn't care about those things back then. There he goes, that's it. Another happy customer, huh? Isn't that awesome? So cocaine has a role also in the development of minimally invasive skull base procedures. Hermann Schloffer, Innsbruck, Austria, 1907. So he's credited with the very first transnasal approach to the pituitary. He did this lateral rhinotomy approach where he kind of, you can see he kind of takes half the nose off, essentially swings it over to the side. Again, entirely done with cocaine anesthesia and done over the course of 3 weeks. He did a little bit more dissection every time with more cocaine. Patient would go back to the room for a week, come back a week later, they would do a little more dissection until he actually got to the tumor. Patient had acromegaly, actually, that he operated on. Harvey Cushing, of course, did not use cocaine anesthesia. There's where the story breaks down. He did ether anesthesia with all of his pituitary tumor resections. Now, that's the story of cocaine, and I focus most of this on cocaine because, frankly, it's just more interesting and more intriguing to realize that we owe so much of our careers here to the presence of cocaine. But I have to say that the endoscope is obviously the second biggest development in the world of rhinology. And this started about 200 years ago with Bozzini. Bozzini was an Italian living in Germany, and Bozzini developed what he called the Lichtleiter, which was actually originally designed for some OB-GYN type procedures, but then rapidly applied for urology procedures as well. So 1806 had a self-contained light source. The best thing about Bozzini, though, was this quote that he has attributed to him, which is really quite amazing when you think about our world today. He says, "Surgery will not only develop new and previously impossible procedures, but all uncertain operations which depended on luck and approximation will become safe under the influence of direct vision, since the surgeon's hand will now be guided by his eyes." I'm not sure how much the Lichtleiter contributed to that, being able to see and to do surgery under direct vision, but needless to say, we do have that benefit nowadays with the endoscope, and it really is quite amazing that he recognized that 200 years ago. And then the story, of course, gets more interesting because then we come to the mid-1900s, and this man, Harold Horace Hopkins, who's a professor of physics in the UK, he has demonstrated the first flexible endoscope in 1957 used for gastroenterologic procedures. And then he subsequently takes a rigid endoscope that was designed for urology, and he modifies this, and he replaces the lenses and such, and is able to develop what we now commonly know is the Hopkins rod telescope. Again, this was developed for urology. It was using as a starting point an available telescope, but he made it much better. It was much brighter, had better contrast, and had better field of view. The available endoscopes at the time had a very narrow field. You really couldn't see anything beyond just the tip of the scope. So this allowed you to see out quite far, and so had great advantage from that standpoint. So Professor Hopkins, he was a physics professor, so what does he do? He decides he's going to go down to a meeting, a urology meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1961, and he's going to demonstrate this. He's going to show this to the urologists and show them how valuable this instrument is. And wandering around the exhibit hall at this meeting is a man named Karl Storz. Karl Storz, an instrument maker from Germany, and that's a picture of Karl Storz with his daughter, who is better known as Mrs. Storz, who still runs the company actually to this day. It is a private company totally owned by the Storz family, very interesting. And she is what you would call a micromanager, but I won't go into that. But, she's not a young lady, and she still has total control of the company to this day. But Karl Storz met Harold Hopkins at this meeting and thought maybe there was something to this scope design that he has. And I guess we can say the rest is history. Professor Messerklinger in Graz utilized one of these early Hopkins rod telescopes, first of all, to start analyzing and looking at the nose, right? He used, the whole, his book, Endoscopy of the Nose, to any of you who have it, and anyone who does rhinologic surgery, you got to have a copy of this book. It's like your holy grail or your Bible of rhinology. It's really cool, actually, to read what he said. But anyway, this Endoscopy of the Nose book is really a book of diagnoses. It's how to use the endoscope for diagnostics. It's not really teaching any techniques on how to do surgery. But Professor Messerklinger obviously recognized its benefits for surgery, and in the last paragraph of his Endoscopy of the Nose book, he says the excellent view into the depths of the nose provided by the endoscope naturally make it desirable to operate under the guidance of the instrument. And that's how the rest of the story is written there. Now, Messerklinger did his operations under Ponticane anesthesia, which is interesting. He didn't use cocaine. However, David Kennedy, when he developed his FACS procedures in the mid-1980s, he did all of his procedures under cocaine anesthesia. So we come full circle now to current day. All right, so, well, where are we now? I think that, it's clear in our world of rhinology that technology is really driving what we're doing, advancing our ability to do surgery, making things simpler to apply. And there's my 10-year-old daughter when she was demonstrating how easy it is to do image-guided surgery. It's amazing how simple some of the equipment is nowadays. We've got intraoperative imaging available to us now, integration with image guidance. Image guidance is somewhat limited because it's not real time, right? But now we're getting the ability to have some real time with intraoperative CT or even intraoperative MRI, so we're getting closer to being able to have real-time imaging for our patients. And of course, we've got better inflammatory disease management. We've got the availability of balloons. That was a little balloon going by. It's a little joke. Drug-eluting stents, and we have the first meta-analysis, sort of a meta-analysis of two trials anyway, showing the benefit of the drug-eluting stents as well. So that brings us to the question of what's number 3. And again, I do think that it's going to be the technology that probably pushes us forward more than anything. And I think that robotics offers some huge possibilities for us in the future. Now, I think it's clear it's not going to be that robot, right, that's making the Mercedes-Benz over there, though that's really what the Da Vinci is down in the corner there. That's really what it's based off of. It's that same type of technology. But, clearly a Da Vinci-type system isn't going to work really for what we do in rhinology. So it's got to be something different, and I think it's going to be something more along this lines. It's going to be more along the lines of using the image guidance technology that we have, recognizing that can create boundaries for dissection, and then building a robot that works within those boundaries. I think that'll be one way that the technology is applied. So it's really analogous to the operation game, which I loved to play when I was a kid. I like to say it's the reason I'm a surgeon today, though I'm not very good at it. But if anyone who's played it, you gotta get your little forceps down, and you can't touch the little edges, right? Because if you touch the little edges, it makes the nose light up, and then you lose. So that's sort of analogous to what I think we can do with image guidance and with robotics today. But I think the bottom line is that we're going to get away from this type of approach. This is a great story here. This is from a textbook written by Greenfield Sluter of Sluter's neuralgia. Remember Sluter's neuralgia, right? Contact point headache, right? So I have a copy of this book in my little library at home. It's called Headaches and Eye Disturbances of Nasal Origin from 1920. And he talks a lot about headaches and eye disturbances. But he also talks about this. There's a chapter on treatment of hyperplastic sphenoiditis. This doesn't get nearly as much press as the stuff on the headaches and all this, but this is fascinating. So he describes in this chapter his experience with this new procedure that he's coming up with, that he's developed for treatment of hyperplastic sphenoiditis. And he describes how he tried this out on a patient. He introduced the knife into the patient's nose, and he places the knife along the cribriform plate. This is what he says. He places the knife, patient awake in the chair, along the cribriform plate. He pushes the knife back because he knows at the back of the cribriform is going to be the sphenoid sinus, and then he gets the resistance, and he pushes in, right? And he says he opened both sides. The reaction, surprisingly, he describes as severe. A coryza without suppuration reestablished the pain, which on the right side was stopped by intrasphenoidal applications of 10% salicylate of methyl, and much improved. Then the patient began to have violent headache, vomiting without nausea, meningitis, and died. Now, so I would argue that this may not be the best approach for treatment of this. However, Dr. Sluter was quite proud of this, right? He was proud enough about it that he went and wrote a whole chapter in his book on it and published it, that this is what needed to be done. So I think the point is that, our world is getting better, and the scientific world is getting better, and our surgical world is getting better. And I think we're better now at trying to study these things rather than just applying random ideas. I think we're getting better with our science and figuring out whether things really work or not. And that's where I believe we're going to be able to go in the future as new ideas and new techniques come forward. So that's all I have. That's the first rhinologist right there. Any questions? Thank you.